Okay, welcome back to another episode. And this is going to be the second time that we discuss communitarianism and some of the issues that are associated with a liberal political structure, which, as we saw last time, is one that takes justice to be its primary concern. And rights and justice go hand in hand. The way that Rawls puts it, if you wanted to kind of put that in a nutshell, is that rights and justice go hand in hand. Rights have priority over any abstract conception of the good that might be imposed upon society, and instead people are able to choose their own ends for themselves according to their own personal vision of the good life and what sort of life they would like to build for themselves. And in order to secure that, they need to be given certain basic rights. And those rights ensure that they have liberty. And you could say that there is a certain way in which the very idea of a liberal society has freedom as its ultimate goal, if there is any goal that it actually has. It is to establish freedom through justice. And rights are the foundation for both of those. Okay, so we were discussing Sandel last time, and this week the past couple of weeks, I've been taking a look at his book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. And he does some new and interesting things in the book that are a little bit different from what he does in the article. One of the claims that he harps on quite a bit in his article is that there's nothing in Rawls's description of the original position, there's nothing in Rawls's formulation of how societies should be ordered that enables community concerns to take precedence over individual concerns. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the liberal society is set up in such a way that individuals are free. They have the liberty to pursue their own ends, to pursue the good insofar as they conceive it in their own lives, and to bring that to fruition. But what about community goods? How do those enter into the picture? How could society be framed in such a way that it didn't seem quite as much set up to enhance individual goods, but also social goods? Is there a way that we can order society so that it's not just about individual freedom, but also about the common good? And one of the criticisms that Sandel brings up regarding the original position, is that there's nothing in it that allows for some prior moral ties upon the individuals in the original position. If you'd like to hear more about the original position, I suggest that just take a listen to the prior episode. I think that position is a little bit oversold. And one thing I would like to bring into the discussion here is the influence that it seems like Locke's conception of the state of nature may have had on Rawls's formulation of the original position. And when you compare the two, when you compare Locke's description of the state of nature and Rawls's original position, I think it's much easier to see that Rawls is not thinking of the individuals in the original position as if they were totally blank individuals with no human nature, without any prior moral ties to the community, in the sense that they don't have any understanding of themselves as members of a community. I think that's going a little bit too far. I think even in the original position in Rawls's description of it, you can see that individuals are kind of assumed to have a particular kind of nature, and it is a nature that seems formulated so that Rawls assumes that everyone wants to pursue their own individual goals, but it's not one that excludes possibility that they also have concerns for other people, for members of their community, as part of that conception of the good that they hold for themselves. And if that is the case, then the discussion that arises in Sandel's article about individuals in the liberal conception as having merely an individuality that doesn't include a sense of themselves as members of community is oversold. So let me just begin by reading what Locke says about the state of nature. So this is in Locke's treatise on the true end of civil government, and I'm going to be reading from chapter 2, entitled On the State of Nature, and this is section 4. To understand political power aright and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. A state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him, by an evident and clear appointment, an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty. So the picture that Locke is painting here is it's described as a state of nature, but I think more accurately, or maybe more pointedly, could be described as the way that people might interact with one another in a case where there was no government to order their actions. Or maybe in some less evolved political order where people are just kind of loosely associated with one another, but they don't have a central authority, they don't have a central government with a government bureaucracy and a police force and all the rest of it. And he's just imagining people as living together in such a way that there is no social hierarchy, there's no social rank that divides them socially. And so they're all equal in that sense. They all have the same rank. No one has authority or dominion over anyone else, except by the common consent of the people themselves. And in this way, as far as what Locke is trying to do, you could say that each individual has a kind of sovereign authority over his goals and aspirations and ends. And as far as Locke is concerned, it should not be, or it should be the goal of the formation of any just society to not work to diminish the kinds of prerogatives that someone in a state of nature would have, to do freely as they wish, to decide what sort of goals or aspirations they have for themselves and pursue them without those aspirations being diminished by somebody else. So anyway, that's Locke's description of the state of nature. I'm going to read a little bit more, skipping down to section number 6. But though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. Though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, all the servants of one sovereign Master, sent into the world by his order, and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not another's pleasure, and being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself, and not to quit his station willfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind, and not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So you can see there that far from excluding considerations of community, there is a deeply grounded sense of community in Locke's description of the state of nature, which flows from the idea that we are all equally created by God. Because we are all equally created by God, we have a kind of implicit brotherhood. To what degree we are strangers to one another we might be. So there ought to be this equality. No one should hinder one another in his liberty. And actually, what we can see here is something quite different from the Hobbesian view of the state of nature as war of all against all. Locke kind of looks at the state of nature as involving a common liberty, a common brotherhood, and a state where reason is finally the law, what decides how people should be treated, which is definitely something that Kant is going to take up in his formulation of the categorical imperative as a final appeal for how society or for how individuals should govern their own conduct. Okay, so you can definitely see where the community aspect arises, and it's definitely a foundational text for the whole liberal project. So let's take a look at what Rawls says about the original position now and see if we can find some commonalities. Here I'm going to be reading from page 19 of A Theory of Justice, and this is section 4 entitled The Original Position. It seems reasonable to suppose that the parties in the original position are equal. Okay, so there we have a parallel with Locke. That is, all have the same rights in the procedure for choosing principles. Each one can make proposals, submit reasons for their acceptance, and so on. Obviously, the purpose of these conditions is to represent equally between human beings as moral persons, as creatures having a conception of their good and capable of a sense of justice. The basis of equality is taken to be similarity in these two respects. Systems of ends are not ranked in value, and each man is presumed to have the requisite ability to understand and to act upon whatever principles are adopted. Together with the veil of ignorance, these conditions define the principles of justice as those which rational persons concerned to advance their interests would consent as equals when none are known to be advantaged or disadvantaged by social and natural contingencies. So just as in the Lockean state of nature, behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, no one has a higher social rank than anyone else. Rationality, reason, debate is the appeal, is the ultimate court of appeal for deciding how society should be ordered. And there also appears to be a kind of commonality that would pave the way for a common sense of the good and a sense of community. So I'll read this part again. Obviously, the purpose of these conditions is to represent equality between human beings as moral persons, as creatures having a conception of their good and capable of a sense of justice. The basis of equality is taken to be similarity in these two respects. So each one recognizes a sense of justice and a sense of the good, even if that is a very thin sense of the good, as something that they can hold in common with other people, at least to the point where we can try to come to some rational agreement about how we would like to have society ordered. So that's a point I'd like to bring out because it seems to me that the sense in which, or the way in which Sandel tries to argue in his article that the liberal conception of the self does not leave any ground for community, for thinking of oneself as a member of community, especially behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, is part of Rawls's conception of the liberal individual, to the extent that there's no way to get from a kind of selfish individuality to a concern for the community. I don't see that at all, and I don't see the liberal individual as being somehow so individualistic, necessarily so individualistic that they wouldn't see the common good as their good as well. So that's an objection to my reading of Rawls's article, where he's taking issue with, let's say, maybe the overweening individuality that he feels arises in John Rawls's theory of justice. From there, I would just like to pivot and talk a little bit about the book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. Just taking a look at page 29. This is in a section entitled Empiricist Objections, where he's taking a look at the influence of Hume on Rawls. And the text reads here, following Hume, Rawls notes that these circumstances, that is, the circumstances which compel people to make justice their first principle or primary principle for ordering society, are of two kinds, objective and subjective. Quote, the objective circumstances of justice include such facts as the moderate scarcity of resources, whereas the subjective circumstances concern the subjects of cooperation, most notably the fact that they are characterized by different interests and ends. This means that each person has a distinctive life plan or conception of the good which he regards as worthy of advancement. Rawls emphasizes this aspect by assuming that, as conceived in the original position at least, the parties are mutually disinterested, that they are concerned to advance their own conception of the good and not someone else's, and that in advancing their ends, they are not bound to each other by prior moral ties. Okay, so you can see there where Sandel is looking at the individuals in the original position as kind of locked into their individuality in such a way that they're not going to have a mutual concern for one another's good, as even insofar as it might impact their own good. And here's the quote from Rawls that he brings in to establish his position. The circumstances of justice are thus summarized. And here he's quoting from Rawls. One can say in brief that the circumstances of justice obtain whenever mutually disinterested persons put forward conflicting claims to the division of social advantages under conditions of moderate scarcity. Unless these circumstances existed, there would be no occasion for the virtue of justice, just as in the absence of threats of injury to life and limb, there would be no occasion for physical courage. The circumstances of justice are the circumstances that give rise to the virtue of justice. In their absence, the virtue of justice would be nugatory. It would not be required, nor for that matter even possible. Quote, but a human society is characterized by the circumstances of justice. Therefore, the virtue of justice is required. So here, what Sandel is pointing out as emerging from Rawls is that it is in the circumstance where there is potential for injustice that the virtue of justice becomes the primary concern. The implication here is that if a society were somehow already one that lacked or that had enough social cohesion so that justice wouldn't be the primary concern, there would actually be no reason to advance that as the first principle or primary principle for how a society should be ordered. I'll read that last part again. In their absence, the virtue of justice would be nugatory, that is, the conditions that would make that a pressing concern. It would not be required, nor for that matter even possible. But human society is characterized by the circumstances of justice, that is, the circumstances that would necessitate justice as a primary virtue. Therefore, the virtue of justice is required. What Sandel seems to be taking aim at here is just the idea that it's not necessarily the case that in every society, in every situation where people get together in the original position, they would necessarily gravitate toward justice as a primary virtue, as the principle that orders society. Now, that is the principle that Rawls thinks people in the original position would naturally gravitate toward, and it's certainly the one that Locke, in his description of the state of nature, wants governments to try to maintain. He wants governments to be there to try to maintain the state of liberty and equality among people. But what Sandel wants to point out is that, Rawls seems to kind of take for granted that anyone in the original position would choose a liberal society, a society founded upon principle of justice, basic rights, and capacity to choose one's own ends without having them diminished by somebody else or diminished to the least degree possible. And he thinks that there might be cases in which some societies, and they don't need to be nation states, might choose the common good as their first priority over individual rights and justice. And the sorts of societies that he has in mind would be societies like small communities. He says trade associations. He mentions the family. But he seems to be implicitly in agreement with Rawls that, at least as far as contemporary society is concerned, the individuals in a society like the one that we've grown up in, we've become accustomed to, would be ones that would naturally gravitate toward the idea that justice needs to be the primary organizing feature of society. So while Sandel is able to bring up an objection against Rawls, the kind of force that it has seems to be attenuated in comparison with the earlier article, in which he seems to be wanting to say that as a matter of social structure, as a matter of structuring society, which is certainly what Rawls has in mind, the structure of society, there are some cases where people might choose to have the good prior to individual rights. The common good is prior to individual rights. And the problem with that, again, is that it leaves the door open for saying that some group's conception of the good, because it takes precedence over individual rights, could decide that the common good is more important than individual rights, that there might be cases where individuals could have their liberties taken away from them, that they could have their basic rights trampled upon in the name of pursuing the common good. But that falls directly into the kinds of problems that Rawls discusses when he takes aim at utilitarianism. For example, why couldn't a society like the Old South decide to justify slavery based upon putting the common good above individual rights? Most people would almost immediately agree that a circumstance where you would allow for injustice like that wouldn't be a society where everyone would feel like, that their liberties were being taken care of. It wouldn't be a society that people would want to live in if, as is the case in the original position, they wouldn't have any prior knowledge of what sort of state they might be in, how their liberties might be violated, if they agreed to live in a society like that. If they agreed to live in a society where the good, the common good, as nice as that sounds, would take precedence over individual rights. Because it's not just the idea that the common good takes precedence over the individual good that's at issue here. It's the idea that the common good should take precedence over individual rights. And to me, it seems like that is not a circumstance that any society should allow. The circumstances where you would want to allow for something like that would have to be very tightly constrained. And to me, the idea that some people would, in the original position, given a chance to decide between one society or another, even in a situation like the ones that Sandel brings up here, cities, towns, trade associations, people who have bonded together in political organizations for a common good, would be something that people would agree to if they sat down in the original position and thought about what sorts of life prospects agreeing to a government formed that way might lead them into. So to me, it seems like it's not something that rational people would agree to. Perhaps you could say in the circumstance where the family is considered to be the society, and that's really kind of putting some strain on the word society itself, might be one where the common good would take precedence over individual rights, because it's kind of hard to think of family members as having individual rights because it's not really a political organization. So to me, I still think Rawls wins out in this debate. And I still think that Sandel hasn't really done enough to convince me, at least, that the constraints of the original position and the way that individuals are conceived when they enter into the original position isn't one that would allow people to see that their individual good could be connected to the common good. All individuals being free, being at liberty to pursue their own individual good, does not preclude the idea that they could rationally decide in favor of a common good when it aligns with their own good. And in fact, any other way of doing that, sacrificing some people's liberty for the sake of the common good, doesn't seem like something that anyone in the original position, where everyone is equal, starting at the same place, would like would like to end up. They wouldn't like that as a possibility for their life prospects or for their descendants in the far future. So with that, I'm going to call it a night on this second edition of discussion on communitarianism and liberalism.